Good evening. It's great to see such a large turnout tonight, and particularly an enthusiastic turnout tonight. So thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to resume our David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series in this academic year. After our time away, it's great to get back to the activities that unite us as a college. If we have not met previously, my name is Michael Feltner, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean at Seaver College. We're especially privileged to have with us this evening one of the leading voices and advocate for great books and liberal education in our country, Dr. Roosevelt Montás. In his most recent book, Dr. Montás states, "Liberal education is not a frivolous distraction from a useful education, but the very thing that will give purpose and direction to a useful education." Dr. Montás, you are among friends tonight, and we share this conviction with you. And I'm thrilled that you've joined us for this evening, and I look forward to our time together. Before beginning this evening's program and introducing Dr. Montás, I want to also welcome, I see Provost Jay Brewster and Vice Provost Lee Katz in the back. Thank you both for being with us. But most importantly, I want to welcome each of you, our faculty, staff, and students who have stayed with us this evening. We're blessed by your presence tonight. Before starting the lecture, I want to briefly discuss our format for tonight. Following our speaker's address, we will take a very brief 2 to 3 minute recess to excuse students who have an evening class beginning at 6 p.m. Students, I ask if you do not have a class at 6 p.m. that you please remain seated for the question and answer session. We will begin the Q&A immediately following that brief recess. During the Q&A, we will have staff roving the auditorium with a microphone. Please stand if you have a question, but wait until you get a microphone before you ask your question so that we can all hear it, please. After the Q&A, we will have a book signing where Dr. Montás will sign his most recent book. And there will also be a ceremony in recognition of our great book students at that time as well. So now I'd like to ask Professor of Mathematics and Great Books, Dr. Don Thompson, to please introduce our honored guest. Don? You're welcome.
Welcome. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming. I think you're in for a treat. It's a treasure to have Roosevelt with us. Roosevelt Montás is a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University. He holds an AB, MA, and PhD in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia. He was the director of the Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia College from 2008 to 18. He specializes in antebellum American literature and culture with a particular interest in American citizenship. His dissertation, Rethinking America, Abolitionism and Antebellum Transformation of the Discourse of National Identity, won Columbia University's 2004 Bancroft Award. In 2000, he received the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a graduate student. He teaches Introduction to Contemporary Civilization of the West, a year-long course on primary texts in moral and political thought, as well as seminars in American studies, including freedom and citizenship in the United States. And of course, he's just recently published the book that has been mentioned. There are copies available for purchase at the end and a book signing opportunity. Well, all of that is what's on the page at Columbia College, Columbia University. But I want to share with you an email exchange I had with Dr. Montás. On the 29th of September, last fall, I wrote, "This is Don Thompson, director of the Great Books program. I'm writing to ask if you're interested and available to come to California in the spring in order to serve as a guest speaker for our Great Books students. Our program is about 35 years old. We read 6 courses in 6 Great Books classes, and it's modeled after the 1952 University of Chicago program. We have about 250 students in our program. Hopefully you can come and shed some light on the to the story you have about great books and how it is such a vital part of your life. I honestly expected to get, well, I'm busy, I'm on the East Coast, we don't go to the West Coast, or something like that, but I did not. The response came quickly. Thank you so much for your email and your kind invitation. I've long admired the Pepperdine Great Books program, and I would be honored to speak at your event. I have fond memories of my involvement with the Association of Core Texts and Courses, which is a program that we participate in. I'm currently working with Princeton Press to get the publication done and my speaking agenda. I hope that you don't mind working with my assistant, but today, literally, my wife and I are going to the hospital to give birth to a baby girl. That got me right there. I'm busy, but I'd still love to come. And he showed me the picture of his now 6-month-old daughter. So he's a proud father, and we're in for a real treat. He's going to tell us his own journey through great books. And if he's like many of us, you don't just read the great books read you. So we welcome Dr. Montás.
Thank you, Don, for that warm introduction. It exemplifies the warmth and the intimacy that I have felt from the moment I stepped onto the campus. I do believe it because I feel it, that I am among friends. And thank you, Dana Dudley, for being the first friend to extend your hand to me and for shepherding me around today. And Don, thank you for letting me sit in your class and enjoy conversation that went so deep, so fast with your students. Same to Frank Novak. Thank you for letting me crash half of your class. And Jonathan Riddle, who also allowed me to take half of his session today to really enjoy free and daring conversation, no holds barred conversation with students. I always make a point of meeting with students when I visit campuses, and with all deference to the eminence of the faculty and staff, it's my favorite thing to do everywhere I go. So the title of my book is Rescuing Socrates: How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. People who have reviewed my book have found out that the book is hard to summarize. If you had to say one thing about it, it'd probably be that the book is fundamentally a defense of liberal education. It's in explaining how the book defends liberal education that things get tricky. To help to give you a sense of how I do that in the book today and expand a little bit on why I do that, maybe at the end read a passage from the book before we move on to questions. But first, let me define liberal education. The idea of liberal education goes back to the ancient democracy of Athens, where it was conceived as the education appropriate for free citizens. Aristotle described it as an education given not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person. All Athenian citizens, the kind of free persons Aristotle had in mind, participated in government by voting directly on the adoption of laws, holding political office, deliberating on juries, serving in the army. The point of liberal education was to prepare citizens for these civic responsibilities. And to this day, democracies depend on a citizenry capable of discharging the duties for which liberal education prepared Athenian citizens. Indeed, the possibility of democracy depends on the success or failure of liberal education. Now, in the slave democracy of Athens, liberal education was distinguished from the education of an enslaved person or the education of a vulgar craftsman. Today, it is distinguished from professional, technical, or vocational education. Liberal education looks to the meaning of human life beyond the requirements of subsistence. Instead of asking how to make a living, liberal education asks what living is for. These studies, says Aristotle, are undertaken for their own sake, whereas those relating to work are necessary and for the sake of things other than themselves. So liberal education concerns itself with the human yearning to go beyond questions of survival to questions of existence. So how do I go about making a case for this practice? One way to think about my book is as composed of three strands, and let me name what those strands are. One of those strands is autobiographical, and that part of the book reads like a memoir where I meditate on how my life has unfolded and the role that liberal education has played in it, the role that it has played in making me the person that I am. That is, how has liberal education played out in this particular life? Then the second strand of the book consists of a discussion of 4 authors that have had a big impact on me and a discussion of why their ideas matter, how those writers explore ideas and questions that can illuminate the life of any individual. That is, how these authors raise and clarify human dilemmas that every person faces and has to resolve in his or her own life. The authors are St. Augustine, particularly the Confessions, Plato, with some writing about Aristotle, Sigmund Freud, and Mahatma Gandhi. Then there is a third strand of the book, and that is a polemical strand. It's a look at the shape and character of American higher education and the place of liberal education in it. I make the basic argument that the modern American higher education environment is essentially hostile to the practice of liberal education, the kind of practice that transformed my life and which I argue throughout the book has the power to transform the lives of young people today. A kind of education that is especially relevant and important to young people who, like me, come from low-income households, are first generation to attend college, or are broadly from what we called marginalized communities. Let me give you a further sense of what these strands do. And let me begin that with pausing on the fact that liberal education shares with self-help, with religion, and with many forms of quackery, a claim to the power to transform lives. It's a big claim to make. But the kind of transformation that liberal education holds out is distinctive and quite different than the possibilities for self-transformation that are offered by self-help, religion, and quackery. Quackery, of course, only offers and doesn't deliver self-transformation. For one thing, the transformative power of education has been experienced by many different kinds of people in many different circumstances and at many different times. For another, the kind of transformation that liberal education promotes is thoroughgoing. It is through and through. There is no backsliding from it. It is a one-way street. Once you achieve it, it cannot be taken away from you. Liberal education was certainly transformative for me. And behind my talk tonight, as in the book, you will detect a concern I share with some other people that the kind of education I discuss is becoming rarer and rarer in colleges and universities, and more out of the reach of people who do not come from backgrounds marked by privilege and opportunity. So this talk and the book I wrote might be seen as a meditation on the kind of education that is transformative and on how we can do better at making it more accessible to more people. The personal aspect of my book reflects my view that the meaning of liberal education lies in the impact it has on the lives of individuals, not on their careers, though that of course is included, but on the way in which individuals live their lives, how they come to understand themselves and how they relate to the world. And it also relates to how I have come to discover that I cannot make a full-throated case for liberal education without also reflecting on how my particular life has been altered and shaped by liberal education. But I'm not unique in experiencing education that way. I would comfortably bet that more than a handful of you listening to me have had similar experience. And let me invoke this experience as it began for one of my intellectual and political heroes, Frederick Douglass. This is a passage from Frederick Douglass's first autobiography from 1845, The Life of an American Slave. Let me say a thing or two about this passage. The first thing is that it uses the N-word, that slur that has become so explosive and kind of high voltage in our society that it's just kind of, it's leaving the public sphere. Just people will not say the word. So I'm not going to pronounce the word. I know enough people who find the word offensive and hurtful, even in a way that when Douglass uses it in 1845, it is a slur and it is dehumanizing and it is only used in a racist way. Today, I think our sensitivity is heightened. I think if I were in an intimate situation, I was reading this, I'd probably just read what Baird Douglas wrote. But this is not, this being a public setting, I ask you to indulge me in not saying the word. So let me frame when this happens. Douglass is describing the moment. So Douglass is born in a plantation in Maryland, and when he's 8 years old or so, his master sent him to live in the city in Baltimore with a relative of his. This relative has a young boy himself, his son, little Thomas Auld, and Douglass is supposed to serve as a kind of companion and servant to the little boy. This is the first time Douglass leaves the plantation, leaves the countryside, and going into the city just blew his mind for many reasons, including the incident I'm about to read. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point in my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, "If you give a slave an inch, he will take an L." We have an equivalent of that saying today. If you give someone an inch, they'll take a mile. Right? An L is like the corner of a house. If you give a slave an inch, he'll take a mile. A slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. And Douglass says, these words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments that lay slumbering, and called into existence a new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been a most perplexing mystery, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. Now, notice this. Douglass is a young boy, but he knows black people. He lives with them. He's one of them. He knows they're smart. He knows they're just as smart as white people. He knows they're strong. He knows that there is no way in which they are inferior to white people. He knows white people. He's a household servant. He knows white people are not smarter or stronger or better in any way than black people. But why is it the white people get to enslave the black people? He can't figure it out. And here he gets the clue. He understands that it has to do with control of the power of literacy. From that moment, he says, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which by the merest incident I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of or trouble, to learn to read. I should say that liberal education today is also the pathway from slavery to freedom. But you might say there's no more slavery. Slavery was outlawed by the 13th Amendment. And of course, it's true that there is no longer in the U.S. chattel slavery, where you and your children are literally owned 24/7 and forever. But there are other forms of subjugation, coercion, and domination that pervade modern life and that have much in common with slavery. Liberal education, the kind of education into which Douglass saw a window in his acquisition of literacy, today is also aimed at charting a path from slavery to freedom, at somehow transforming you in such a way that you are forever unfit to be a slave. Let me point you to two broad domains in which forms of enslavement persist in contemporary life. One is public and one is private. One pervasive form of subjugation that exists around us is what we can call wage slavery. That's when you sell your labor for a period of time and are, during that time, effectively subject to someone else. This form of slavery was recognized in antiquity when there still existed chattel slavery. Cicero mentions it in his famous book on duties, where he says that, quote, whoever gives his labor for money sells himself and puts himself in the rank of slaves. That attitude, by the way, lasted way into the 19th century, that it was somehow degrading and a insult to your humanity to go and sell yourself for some period of time, even if you got to go home at the end of the day, to put yourself under the subjection of some master for money. I'm not going to get very much into this, but let me say that it's almost taken for granted today that this is okay, that it's some kind of life to sell yourself to servitude and dehumanization from Monday to Friday in order to buy the privilege of living on the weekends. But that's not so. This is not the worthiest life for a human being. There is no virtue in that, no expression of human excellence, no recognition of human dignity, but on the contrary, a degrading brutalization of human nature. So it's no education to prepare you or convince you to sell some portion of your humanity for wages. That's not education. Yes, of course, education should give you skills and competencies that have value in the marketplace and enable you to make a better living than you would without education. But there is also a higher calling for education. And in our colleges and universities, the liberal arts are the curricular expression of that calling. Education should also be about how to be free, about how to live the life of a free individual, not how to live the life of a hired laborer. But that's one form of subjugation that exists today. There is another, even more pervasive form of subjugation and slavery. And that is when one aspect of ourselves exerts tyrannical control over another. Here, let me quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau from The Social Contract, where he writes, as a kind of side note, he's making a different point. He says, but for to be driven by appetite alone is slavery. An obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself is freedom. This even more pervasive aspect of servitude has to do with the contradictorily layered nature of our psyche. Freedom, is great, but it brings its own problems. Until recently, many of you lived at home under the governance of your parents. As you no doubt remember, one of the shocks of college life is the challenge of self-governance. Most people who fail at college fail not for intellectual reasons, that the material they are asked to learn is just beyond their grasp, but because of failures of self-governance. How do we organize the tangle of psychic forces, conflicting desires, and contradictory impulses that coexist in our mortal frame? You know, I want to be fit, but I don't want to work out. I want to be on time to my appointment, but I don't want to get up. I want to smell good, but I don't want to bathe. Our desires don't care about logic. They don't know anything about logic. You desire perfectly incompatible, contradictory things fiercely and at the same time. How do we manage that freedom? I submit to you that the maximal possibilities for human freedom, once our legal freedom has been reasonably secured, come from the optimal organization, from the more or less successful integration of our inner lives. When Douglas, listening to his enslaver, recognizes that learning would forever unfit him to be a slave, he's hearing a recognition that education encourages inner developments that transform your life from the inside out in a way that liberates and that is irreversible. That is why liberal education is not just about honing the capacity for sound judgment, which involves skills, discursive skills like critical thinking, logical reasoning, analysis, synthesis, and the like. But liberal education also involves cultivating excellence of character, a kind of affective disposition that involves notions like honesty, virtue, integrity, and humility. In liberal education, there is no clear distinction, no clear line of separation between these notions as intellectual virtues and as traditional moral virtues. Liberal education, beginning with its central notion of freedom, is necessarily a values-based education. And let me say as a side note that failing to recognize this and consciously examine this aspect of liberal education, it's values-based, handicaps the practice and saps it of its vitality and meaning. And this helps explain its general weakness in higher education today. So back to the story of rescuing Socrates and how and why I wrote it the way I did. By the time I started writing the book, I had spent 10 years as director of the Columbia Center for the Core Curriculum, and many more than that, teaching and advocating for liberal education based on the study of foundational texts. Even though I always recognize the value of liberal education to be rooted in subjective and personal experience, throughout my time as director of Columbia's Core Curriculum, I avoided making the case for liberal education with reference to my own life story. My reluctance stemmed from my distaste for the stereotypes associated with the immigrant story, with the rise from poverty and marginality through education. It's not that these things aren't true about me, but that I have been averse to turning those aspects of my life into an identity. In the same way, and probably for the same reasons, I have resisted a force I have felt pressing on me from the whole culture to define my identity primarily in terms of my ethnicity and the color of my skin. But the decision to write a book making my full case for liberal education caused something to unlatch inside of me. It was suddenly clear that I could only write such a book in the first person and with my whole self in it. My case for liberal education would have to braid together the arguments and insights I had developed over the course of my academic career with an honest examination of my inner and outer life and how it had been shaped by liberal education. This is what Rescuing Socrates is about. Though I'm not just going to read passages from the book today, I do hope that you permit me to speak as I do in the book with my whole self and to knead into my remarks on great books and liberal education reflections of a more personal sort. So, to get some of the autobiographical details out of the way, I grew up in a small rural town in the foothills of big mountains in the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States not speaking English 2 days before my 12th birthday. The town I grew up in the Dominican Republic was in the interior, and it was immersed in the agrarian and pre-industrial rhythms of the 19th century. It extended 6 streets in one direction and 4 streets in the other. My childhood address was Calle 6, Casa 7, the 7th house on the 6th street. I remember when our roads were paved and when we got running water. At home, we had no television, no stove, no refrigerator, no phone. Sometimes as a shorthand, I say that I grew up in the 19th century among people who had grown up in the 18th century. So there is a considerable distance, not measurable in miles, between there and here. The role that liberal education played in that trajectory is the motive force, the little engine that drives my advocacy of liberal education and which gives it its particular contours. I landed in New York City in 1985 with my older brother to join my mother, who had emigrated 2 years earlier. In many ways, we were a typical Dominican immigrant family of the time, poor, not speaking English, and with little knowledge of what life in the U.S. would entail. But having had seen enough to be convinced that whatever it was, it would have better opportunities for us than life in the Dominican Republic. My mother got and then lost a minimum wage job in a garment factory. My brother and I moved to a basement room in the house of a distant relative for a few years while Mom fared for herself. We went to the local public school. We didn't live paycheck to paycheck since we didn't have jobs, but we did live hand to mouth. It was kind of rough going. You can read about it in the book. My point is that when I speak about liberal education and how it can illuminate a life, how it can give people unique tools to navigate their inner and outer worlds and empower them to transform their reality, I speak from personal experience. Allow me now to say a few words about the term great books. When I couldn't come up with a title for this book at all after I wrote it. I just completely gave up. All I told my editor is, try to put the words liberal education in there, in the title. Didn't work. But the words that did end up there are great books. And great books is a term with a history. Well, I'm not going to rehearse that history here. Suffice it to say that the term is associated with a movement that had a somewhat restricted conception and a list of which were the great books. I use the term in a looser way, but I still find it useful since the books on that list are pretty good books. The adjective great with reference to books is, of course, a contestable term. We may disagree on what constitutes greatness in a book. Not only that, there is a widespread belief among professors of literature that there is no such thing as a great book. That the designation great is only a way of asserting and perpetuating particular power structures and prevailing forms of discursive domination and exclusion. I will not engage with this widespread belief among the literary intelligentsia, except to say that while the view is based on an important insight, it takes that insight and turns it into an absurd dogma. We can take the insight without adopting the dogma. We can think of a great book as one that contributes in some outstanding way to the kind of liberal education I have been describing. A great book speaks to our shared human condition. That is, it speaks beyond its immediate historical and cultural context. It is not great because it reflects its specific historical and cultural context. It is great for some other reason. It is not so simply by reflecting cultural, historical, economic situatedness, but because it can speak beyond that, because of something that transcends its historical particularity and illuminates our shared humanity. Moby Dick is not great because it teaches all about New England whaling. It is great for some other reason. Dante's Divine Comedy is not great because of his immersion in the theology of the medieval church or in the factional intrigues of central Italy's politics. But the Divine Comedy is great. It's great because in the midst of those trappings, it can reveal something that is vitally meaningful to, say, a 21st century unbelieving Dominican immigrants to the United States. By the same token, it is not Toni Morrison's immersion in the legacy of American slavery that makes her novels great, but her ability to make that human experience alive and accessible to someone who has no historical connection to it. Great works are great because of an evident yet elusive capacity to illuminate our shared humanity. You could say, as others have, that a great book is one that people read and value for a long time after it was written. According to that definition, in order to be great, an author must be dead. While I can't sign up for that conclusion, I do think that our judgment about a book's greatness, its capacity to transcend its own historical particularity, becomes less certain the closer to our own moment it is. There are other things that characterize great books, some of which I'll mention, but I won't expand on them for the sake of time. But for example, great books tend to be complex. They resist ideological reduction. They resist use as sources of indoctrination. They are multivocal. In the case of great literature, great books are not summarizable. You can only get what great literature has to give by experiencing it as it is. You have to go through it. It's the experience of it, not the knowledge of what it says, that does the work of literature. The Wikipedia entry won't do. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Revelation, it cannot be received secondhand. One more word about great literature. And with this I will end and maybe read a passage from the book. Great literature is the absolute best way we have of approaching the experience of what it's like to be someone else. In the form of the novel, I believe it is the most successful technology ever devised to understand the world from someone else's point of view. And that is the highest aim and aspiration of education, to learn to see the world from somebody else's point of view. You cannot get inside somebody's head. The closest you can do is read great literature. Through great literature, you can spend hour after hour seeing the world and reasoning through situations with someone from a different gender, a different class, a different culture, a different time. You know, part of the problem with our technological revolution, or revolutions, is that they have been driven by engineering breakthroughs and shaped by people with computational genius who can be quite naive about history, philosophy, art, and literature. This is actually one of the reasons why liberal education, while being progressively weakened in the contemporary academy, is in fact more important today than it has ever been. For the psychological complexities of human behavior have preoccupied great authors since forever. And there is something profound for us to learn about human behavior by studying great writers. In fact, there is something profound to be learned by reading great literature that cannot be learned in any other way. Great books give us access to truths about the human condition that are not available in any other way. Not in the hard sciences, not in the social sciences, and not in the course of our ordinary human experience in the world. To understand what is ethical, to understand what policies will work, to evaluate the consequences of a given technology, to anticipate how society will assimilate an invention, you need to understand something that can broadly be called culture. You can think of culture as a grid of interconnected practices, traditions, values, and implicit understandings in which every single individual is embedded. We live radically embedded in these webs and have no human existence outside of them. To understand an individual, you have to understand culture. And there is no better way to understand culture than through the enduring stories it tells about itself and the arguments that have shaped its understanding of itself. Writing in 1940, the intellectual Louis Mumford, observing the rise of fascism in Europe, criticized Western liberalism for its tepid response and wrote an essay in the New Republic called The Corruption of Liberalism. One line from that essay that often sticks out to me is his claim that it is not Ricardo, that's Ricardo the economist, it is not in Ricardo or Marx or Lenin, but in Dante and Shakespeare and Dostoevsky that an understanding of the true sources of fascism can be found. I think that today, as we seem to be entering a new period of great power rivalry and complex multipolar geopolitical conflict, reading literature and studying culture again becomes the most important source for us to navigate the human complexities that will shape policies, our military development, our economy in the decades ahead. Let me end with this, and then I'll read some passages. And here I want to address especially the students who are here and whom I am delighted to see make up the preponderance of the audience. Sometimes people say that the point of liberal education is exactly its uselessness, that it is not pursued as a means to obtain anything else, but that it is simply sought for its own sake. I see the point, but I disagree with that way of looking at it. A liberal education is extremely useful, and we pursue it for the highest of human ends. To put it simply, a liberal education is there to help you find your way. And this is your basic task in life, to find your way. There is in the final analysis nothing else to do in your life but to find your way. Not someone else's way, not the way of your role models or of your elders, not the way of success, but your way. A liberal education does not tell you what your way is, but it equips you for a kind of self-exploration and investigation of the world around you that can lead to genuine living, to a life of honesty and clarity. That life might include making a lot of money, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you rich. That life might include having an impact on many lives around you, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you a benefactor of humanity. That life might include many friends, or it might not. The point isn't to turn you into a social butterfly. But a liberally educated life will be richer than otherwise. It will be more true. It will be more awake. It will be more alive and creative, and it will be more free. To modify a quote from Henry David Thoreau, if a liberal education does one thing, it is to ensure that when you come to die, you don't then discover that you have not lived. Okay. Thank you. Let me really end by reading two passages from the introduction to the book. One will give you a sense of the title. In my sophomore year of high school, I came upon a remarkable book in a garbage pile next to the house where we rented an apartment in Queens. It was the second volume of the pretentiously bound Harvard Classics series, and it contained a set of dialogues by Plato that record the last days of Socrates' life. This first encounter with Socrates was as fortuitous as it was decisive. There is probably no better introduction to the life of the mind than Socrates' defense of his philosophic activity in these dialogues. For over a decade, I have used these same dialogues every summer to introduce low-income high school students to a world that, almost without exception, had been until then inaccessible and inconceivable to them. The series of short dialogues are set in the days leading up to Socrates' execution. He emerges in them vividly and heroically. Throughout his ordeal, he insists that the good life, the beautiful life, and the just life are the same, and that no matter what the city of Athens might threaten to do to him, he cannot give up the practice of philosophy. The youth of Athens love him, but the authorities find him an unbearable nuisance and, as Jesus would come to seem to the Romans, a dangerous political liability. Indeed, the citizens of Athens, finding 70-year-old Socrates guilty of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods into the city, condemn him to death. Socrates accepts the verdict, rejects the plan his friends hatched to whisk him away from prison before the execution, and in obedience to the laws of the city he held dear, drinks the poison at the appointed hour, surrounded by the very friends he was accused of corrupting and philosophizing to the very end. Every year, I witnessed Socrates bringing students, my high school students as well as my Columbia students, to serious contemplation of the ultimately existential issues his philosophy demands we grapple with. My students from low-income households do not take this sort of thinking to be the exclusive privilege of a social elite. In fact, they find in it a vision of dignity and excellence that is not constrained by material limitations. Some of these students, as was the case with me, will go on to elite colleges and find themselves surrounded by peers far wealthier and far better educated than they. Socrates whispers to them not to mistake these marks of privilege for true expressions of merit, and to find in their own intellectual integrity a source of self-worth and self-respect that surpasses any material advantage their peers might have over them. When making the case for liberal education to low-income students and families, I often point out that there is a long tradition of steering working-class students towards an education in servitude, an education in obedience and docility, an education in not asking questions. The idea that liberal education is only for the already privileged, for the pampered elite, is a way of carrying on this odious tradition. It is a way of putting liberal education out of the reach of the people who would most benefit from it, precisely the people who have been historically denied the tools of political agency. I asked them to take a look at who sends their children to liberal arts colleges and at what liberal arts college graduates go on to do with their useless degrees. Far from a pointless indulgence for the elite, liberal education is in fact the most powerful tool we have to subvert the hierarchies of social privilege that have kept those who are down, down. And then let me read this passage with which I end the introduction that reflects on my arrival at Columbia, my experience of finding myself in this strange new world. I didn't know what the Ivy League was when I applied and got into Columbia, or what the core curriculum was, or what great books were. I was admitted to Columbia University through its opportunity programs, an admissions category created to meet the requirements of the New York State Higher Education Opportunity Program, which provides generous financial aid and academic support to low-income students. It had been 6 years since I had arrived from the Dominican Republic. Everyone in the know at Columbia understood that a HEOP student belonged to a cohort of poor, mainly black and brown students with SAT scores below the mean of other admitted students. We stuck out on campus to veteran faculty, to experienced administrators, savvy students, and each other. Waiting for me and my group of about 20 HEOP students was Literature Humanities, that mammoth and daring course that has greeted every new Columbia student since 1937. I was still learning a lot of new English vocabulary that first year of college, and laboriously piecing together things that were common knowledge to just about everyone around me. Lit Hum was my first full immersion into American culture, or at least the particular slice of American culture that was the Columbia College entering class of 1991. So my freshman year was an education not only in the works of the Lit Hum syllabus, but in that which for everyone else went without saying, the givens of the social world into which I was beginning to live. And those two forms of education mingled together, illuminating each other and etching particularity on each other. That mingling happened in conversations in the classroom and in the dean's office of the School of General Studies, where I secured a 20-hour-a-week work-study job. I did not contribute much to the conversations in the classroom. I did not feel familiar enough to allow myself public opinions. I mainly observed my peers. I was studying them as well as the books. 2 hours on Mondays and 2 hours on Wednesdays. Weekends spent sitting in my room and in the lounges of my dorm reading. By the end of that first year, my education included a bank of information about how people behaved around those old books and the big questions they raised. A first and tentative sense of the norms of expression, affect, and sensibility of the peculiar world into which I had landed. I was observing and absorbing styles of expression, accents, quirks, tones, turns of phrases, ways of being a person. Yet the insights of that first year were more often about myself than about the books I was reading or the peers I was watching. I didn't know then that this is precisely where the greatest value of a liberal education lies, in turning students' eyes inward, into an exploration of their own humanity under the provocation of works that have proven their power to inspire just such self-reflection. I had come into LitHum expecting to learn about text and authors, and little suspecting that these concrete aspects of what I'd learned would prove to be mere vehicles for a far deeper and transformative kind of education. That inward education came slowly, almost unconsciously. It was not like the flipping of a switch, but like the dawning of a day. Many of the conversations we'd had in the classroom about the books and ideas that were rushing upon us went over my head. But like a recurring tide that leaves behind a thin layer of sediment each time it comes, eventually forming recognizable structures, the intensive reading and twice-weekly discussions were coalescing into an altogether new sense of who I was and of the possibilities of my life. My LitHum professor was an old veteran by the time I showed up in his classroom with unkempt hair and clothes that adhered to no known style. He passed away while I was in graduate school. He was one of those rare figures one almost never meets in research universities anymore, an undergraduate teacher with tenure. When Columbia College and the university's graduate programs merged their faculties in the late 1980s, Wallace Gray continued to teach undergraduates only, becoming the longest-serving literature humanities instructor on their faculty. I remember him saying to my class that he hoped to die with a piece of chalk in his hand, which he very nearly did. I remember him shedding tears while reading to the class from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I remember his attentiveness to me. He liked to write plays, but not scholarly books. His one book, Homer to Joyce, is a collection of 18 sparkling essays on the books on the LitHum syllabus. On the last day of class, he inscribed my copy of the book. I didn't take full note of what he had written there until many years later, when I was placing his book on my shelves in the new office I was to occupy as director of the Center for the Core Curriculum. The printed dedication on the book reads in capital letters, "For my students." Underneath that, dated May 1st, 1992, he wrote, "And especially for Roosevelt Montás, we need young men of your intelligence and sensitivity to carry on the humanist tradition in teaching." I am still humbled that Wallace Gray would say that of me. When he wrote it, he could not know that he would die of a heart attack 9 years later at age 74, and I could not know that what he was writing on my book was a prophecy. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Jonah Wong. I'm a freshman here. I'm in Great Books 2 right now. And I was looking over your book on the Gandhi chapter, and I wanted to know the connection between suffering and some higher being that I think Plato talks about a lot. And I wanted to know what specifically about that vow, like commitment to suffering, connects you to this eternal realm, I guess. And what is it that differentiates that life to this life of like comfort and ease in, I guess, the atheist view? What makes that so different?
Yeah. Oh man. Didn't I say easy questions? So you put your finger on a really kind of extraordinary aspect of human experience and of the spiritual path that has been identified and followed and commented on by people from all different religions and traditions. That is, every religious tradition has recognized some kind of relationship between suffering, sometimes suffering that just comes on you like from tragedy, the loss of a child, the loss of a loved one, some accident, some random tragedy, or suffering imposed on yourself by ascetic practices, by forms of continence that are painful. A relationship between that suffering and revelation, truth, intimacy with the divine. And human psychology is complex, but the phenomenal, that is the evident relationship between those things is undeniable because it's everywhere. And even Nietzsche recognizes it. Nietzsche's third essay in the Genealogy of Morals, called on the meaning of the ascetic ideal, is very much about that. It's very much about the way that certain forms of self-binding, certain forms of self-restraint, in fact, unleash extraordinary psychological power, extraordinary force. Gandhi was a master of this. Now, Gandhi says that suffering, bravely suffered as the result of injustice, unleashes tremendous power. And again, you can see that illustrated. Think of the police in Birmingham unleashing dogs on protesters or civil rights, or water cannons on them, and the images and the power that generates. Just seeing somebody innocent or engaged in the pursuit of justice being punished and suffering from it. But there's also this connection in the self. We are right now in the period of Lent, right? This is a traditional Christian period in which people undertake various forms of ascetic practices, not eating meat, giving up this or that, extra prayer, whatever, but forms of abstinence, forms of withdrawal, forms of the denial of satisfaction as a spiritual practice. So there is no question that those things are connected. There's a reverse kind of psychological phenomenon to that, which is that the gratification of every desire actually leads to psychic chaos and unhappiness. You might think, or I don't know, you want to satisfy your desires. You want pleasant experiences. You want pleasure. You want comfort. You want ease. Yet the success in getting those doesn't seem to satisfy. And this is a problem that very wealthy people have. Very wealthy people are often miserable in ways that, like a poor person says, "Gosh, if I only had all of that, I would be very happy." But actually, it's not. They wouldn't be very happy. But the satisfaction of our desires doesn't seem to be the way to either happiness or to human fulfillment. Now, what is it? What is the way? Well, I wish I knew, but somehow the conscious relation to suffering seems to be a key to it. So I don't have a good answer for that. I encourage you to explore in your own life how suffering impacts you. Again, either the kind of suffering that comes on you out of nowhere and for no reason of your own, just because in life we will experience things that are very sad, sometimes crushing, sometimes unspeakably horrible things that happen to you, and which push you to limits you didn't know. I heard somebody kind of describe, like, you hit the floor, you hit the ground level, the basement, and then you realize that there's some layers, some floors down there they didn't even know even existed. We will all experience things like that in our lives. Study that. Try to see what that does to you. Some people talk about it cleansing in some way. It's somehow liberating in some way, in some higher way. It doesn't make it less painful, less terrible. And then I encourage you to experiment with your own forms. What would it mean to eat less than you were satisfied for a particular meal? Does that do anything to you? Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't do anything to you. What does it mean to engage in forms of self-discipline simply to experience and experiment what that means? One thing about the religious life, and I don't know if you're a religious person, but the religious life seems to always involve some measure of self-discipline and discipline of the senses. And not only the religious life, but the scholarly life, the scholarly life requires that. Intellectual virtue and intellectual pursuits are a kind of asceticism. You cannot do it without a kind of self-discipline and asceticism, and the denial of certain kinds of entertainment and pleasures in the pursuit of truth. That's what scholars do. Even atheist scholars, that's required. The life of the mind somehow demands a form of asceticism. There's a great book that was written last year or the year before by a St. John's tutor named Zena Hitz called is it For the Love of Learning? Give me a second. Lost in Thought, the hidden pleasures of an intellectual life, Lost in Thought, that very much talks about intellectual life as a kind of asceticism. But anyway, it's a profound question, a theological question, a psychological question, a social question that I encourage you to explore, but you've certainly put your finger on something that's real. There is something about suffering that is connected to something way beyond suffering, and that is not, and that somehow points to some of the higher capacities and possibilities of human life and fulfillment. Yeah.
So I'm Steve Bauer. I teach marketing in the Business Administration Division. Thank you for that amazing talk.
Thank you.
Really. So my question is, how do you integrate a liberal education, best integrate a liberal education into the teaching of business?
Yeah, okay, great. So let me say a few things. One is, gosh, I have so much to say about this. My mind is going in 10 different directions. First of all, I think a liberal education is something that can happen outside of an institution, outside of college. And many people get a liberal education without attending college. And that's important. We mustn't just restrict liberal education to something that happens in the classroom. Liberal education is important throughout the educational system. That is, it's important that we infuse the values and practices and orientation towards liberal learning even from the earliest forms of learning. I think that the sweetest spot for liberal education is this moment in which, say, the Great Books curriculum happens, kind of the college years, the moment at which you are individuating and separating from the tutelage of your parents. You begin to organize your own life according to your own notions of good and who you are and what you are. There's something that's especially fertile about that period in life to engage in liberal education. Then we go beyond that, and it seems to me that bringing liberal education to the professions and the professional education is absolutely important and absolutely critical. In medical school, in business school, in law school, you name it. Now, I don't know the first thing about a business school curriculum, but I do know that at the bottom of a humanist education is this exposure to the complexity of human experience. So I can very easily imagine, but I've never thought of it until this moment, a business literature course where you read books or literary works or even philosophical works that concern themselves with business, that concern themselves with commerce, with finance, with the kinds of issues that are dealt in the business world. I can imagine kind of case studies that have an orientation towards the human complexities that are involved. Because ultimately, I mean, doing business is doing business with human psychology. Ultimately, all business has to do with the deep forces of human psychology, with the needs, with satisfying those needs, with generating those needs. It is all dominated by human psychology. So it seems to me that there would be significant opportunities and a significant value in infusing a business education with humanist liberal learning. I wouldn't be the person to come up with a curriculum like that. Maybe you would. But it seems to me like an amazingly rich area in which to, and I would be surprised if some people haven't thought about it and worked on that. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. My name is Jennifer Smith. I teach English. And I'm wondering whether you think it's possible to require a liberal education. I'm sure you've heard, we're talking a lot about general education here, and you're talking about freedom and choices and self-governance. Is there such a thing as liberal education when it is required?
Compulsory liberal education. Yes. I have a 4-year-old, and I'm doing my best to liberally educate my 4-year-old, and that doesn't mean I don't read him the Iliad and stuff like that. He'll get to that eventually, but it's stuff like going to the potty, in the potty, and wearing a coat when it's cold outside. He doesn't have the executive function to make those decisions for himself, and sometimes not only do I have to make them for himself, sometimes I have to enforce them on him, and that is not a violation of his liberty in some broader way. And I did it as an example. He can't organize his own education into freedom, but I am training and equipping him to be a free human being, but he cannot organize that himself from his point of view. Something similar happens to students. Sometimes you hear people say that, let's just let students choose their own curriculum and study what they're interested in. And that sounds like liberty, that sounds like freedom, but in fact, students do not have the context, do not have the knowledge base in which to make free decisions, right? It's not a free decision for me. It's not true freedom for Arjuna to make his decisions about what he's going to wear and what he's going to eat, because he doesn't have the knowledge base from which he could exercise that freedom. So it is important at every stage of education, including higher education, that people who have specialized, who get paid for, and who have dedicated their lives to thinking about curricula, organize a curricula that is conducive and that is meant to maximize a liberal education. That's what a university is for. That's what the institution is there for, is precisely to think about, accumulate knowledge, accumulate a tradition, accumulate a body of expertise that would be conducive to that. Because there are ways of doing it well and there are ways of doing it poorly. And again, what we are about is figuring out what are the right ways to do it right. So it is part of our responsibility as faculty and as institutions to organize an educational curriculum that would equip the student and nourish the student in the arts of freedom. They will eventually go on and build their life. So that's what they come here to do. That's why they pay tuition. That's why they put themselves subject to our intellectual authority. It's precisely because we're in that position. That's part of the deal. It is an abdication of that responsibility and a kind of criminal negligence by us to just tell the student, go and choose whatever you want and do whatever you want, and we'll, as long as you gather 126 credits, we'll give you a diploma. So I think, yes, compulsory curricular paths of liberal education do not contradict, but in fact support and emerge out of the idea of liberal education. It's my view anyway.
Hi, my name is Tessa. I'm the manager at the Seaver bookstore.
Hi, Tessa.
I have a question about how would you encourage someone to get into reading the great books that don't have to read them because it's not required?
It's not right. Yeah.
Or where would you have them begin?
Yeah.
Because not everyone's in higher education. So,
yeah.
But to encourage them to read those books that they don't have to read for a class,
yeah.
how would you, or where would you start them
yeah.
to?
That's great. I love that question. And I encounter it a lot. A couple of things I say. One is, and I'm going to imagine that it's you who's in this situation, although I don't know if you're asking it for yourself, but it's don't force yourself to read books that you don't find interesting. There is like a list of a canon. There are kind of classical texts. There's Plato and Aristotle and all these names that you hear. And maybe you'll go and open one of those books and it does nothing. Stop, find something else. There are plenty of books. There will be some books that do grab you. and go with those first. The other thing I would say is liberal education is something that happens between people, not something that happens between books and people, or between institutions and people, or between groups and people. It's something that happens between individuals. So I would encourage you to find someone who is also interested and to read together. If it's a small group, then even better, where you can get together over dinner or over coffee or something, and you've all read the same 20 or 50 pages, and talk about what you think, what struck you, what you found interesting there. And there's like another layer. If you know somebody who has some kind of expertise in that book or knows that book very well, invite them to be part of the conversation. Well, I know you've read this book. I know you studied it in college or whatever, or you majored in this. Can you come in? We'll buy you coffee and let's just join us in the conversation. And then there are resources. If you want to get even deeper, if you want to read a little bit about like the history of the author, of the history of the book, and there's just tons of resources, beginning with Google, Wikipedia, for that. But I find, you all know that programs like the Great Books program here or the core curriculum at Columbia are the exception. They used to not be the exception, but today they're kind of the leftovers of a different idea about liberal education that has been dismantled, and I think that process has kind of reached its watermark, and I think there's a little bit of reconstruction that's happening, but there are other bigger forces that are causing continued pressure. But anyway, I think that liberal education is thriving outside of the university more than inside the university. There are lots of kind of groups and the arts, film, literature, theater, music. I mean, it's vibrant and amazing and explosive happening out in the general culture, less so, at least in a structured way, in the university. So I'm a huge fan and advocate of liberal education outside of the classroom. Yeah. Okay.
I suppose I'll take one since I have the mic privilege. You just touched a little bit on the arts. Earlier you said something to the extent of that great literature is the best tool we have to kind of understand different people's perspectives. I was just curious, what differentiates, in your mind, great literature from other forms of art that might be a little easier to digest for the average person that maybe doesn't want to sit down and read a book, but would, is more inclined to turn on a movie or something?
So like film or something?
Right.
Yeah. Again, it's a hard question. I think film is a absolutely powerful and legitimate and transformative medium for storytelling. Like, I think I'm hard pressed to name things that books and literature that, well, actually I can imagine, but I don't discount the value and the power of visual narrative, visual storytelling to achieve some of the aims of liberal education, the critical skills, the imaginative extension, etc. I think there is something about the written word. First of all, there is a treasure trove, there is a tradition, there is a lineage of textual richness that is only accessible in that way. And if you don't do it, you miss out on that. Secondly, I think there is something about the capacity for verbal expression that is uniquely human. I mean, so is our visual cortex, right? Like, our visual cortex and our linguistic capacity are probably the two most distinctively developed capacities in humans. But language and its symbolic representation, it's probably the closest thing you get. So I think there is a kind of privileged a privileged position that literature gets because of that, but it's not exclusive. And I would say, if you are, like to the previous question, yeah, watch great films. Now, of course, one thing is that all great films are recent creations, right? So you're not going to get some of that old stuff. But yeah, great films, I think, are a powerful and effective aspect of the kinds of material that you can use for liberal education. Yeah.
This will be our final question.
Hi.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
My name's Adian Maston. I'm a political science student. I'm also studying religion. Just a quick question, kind of bouncing off Professor Smith's. Would you agree that liberal education is a necessary condition for an equitable democracy?
Yes, I would agree with that. Democracy means rule of the people. Democracy is this crazy idea that for most of human history was just mocked and never used to work. And we're having the longest run of a functioning democracy, as imperfect as our democracy is, that there has ever been. But the idea that the people rule, the idea that an ordinary person would have the capacity, the cognitive capacity, the character capacity, and the kind of leisure to engage in the kind of deliberation, the kind of processing of information, the kind of decision making, the kind of weighing of complex and contradictory information sometimes, making policies. I mean, those are as complex objects of human understanding as there are. The fact that the idea that an ordinary person is going to participate in that requires that ordinary person be liberally educated. So absolutely, and in fact, we cannot have a democracy. And part of the reason why our democracy is in such trouble is because we have failed to educate a population that is capable of discharging the responsibilities, the duties, the tasks of citizenship. And there is no, we need to do a lot of things to fix or to improve our democracy in our society. One of the things that we can't do anything of that without is a better job at doing liberal education for democratic society. Liberal education as general education. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, so much.